The cowboy widower meets a too old bride left at the station and marries her that day. The small western town of Dry Creek was quiet most days. A few wooden buildings stood along the dusty road, and the wind often carried sand across the empty street. People there lived simple lives. Everyone knew each other, and nothing surprising happened very often. Just outside the town lived a cowboy named Samuel Carter. Samuel was known as a hard-working and honest man. He owned a modest ranch with a few horses and some cattle. Every morning he woke up early before the sun rose, made a cup of coffee, and started his work. His days were filled with fixing fences, feeding animals, and riding across the wide land. But even though Samuel worked hard and stayed busy, his life felt very quiet. Samuel had once been happily married. His wife, Anna, had been kind and cheerful. She loved the ranch and often planted flowers near their small wooden house. The place had once been full of laughter. But Anna had passed away many years earlier after sudden illness. Since that day, the ranch had never felt the same. Samuel kept living there because the ranch was the only place that still reminded him of the good days they had shared. Still, when the sun went down and the evening became silent, the loneliness often felt heavy. People in town sometimes told Samuel that he should marry again. They said a man shouldn't live alone for so long. Samuel always gave the same gentle answer. Some things are not easy to replace. Because of this, he spent most of his time alone with his horses and the open land. One warm afternoon, Samuel rode his horse into Dry Creek. He needed to buy supplies, flour, coffee beans, and some tools for repairing a fence. The town looked the same as always. The general store door creaked as people came and went. A few men sat outside the barber shop talking about the weather. The sound of a hammer came from the blacksmith shop, but something unusual was happening near the train station. Dry Creek did not get many trains. When a train arrived, people usually gathered just to watch. Samuel noticed a small group standing near the wooden platform. Curious, he tied his horse near the store and slowly walked toward the station. The train had already left. Its distant whistle could still be heard fading across the open plains. But one person had remained behind. A woman stood near a bench on the platform. She held a small brown suitcase with both hands. Her dress was simple but neat, and a light travel coat rested on her shoulders. Her face looked calm, but there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. Samuel noticed something else. No one was standing with her. The townspeople nearby were whispering to each other. Samuel stepped closer and overheard part of their conversation. "That must be the mail-order bride," one man said quietly. "Yep," another replied. "Came all the way here for a man who ordered a wife through the agency. So where's the groom?" The first man shook his head. He saw her step off the train, and then he walked away. A woman nearby sighed softly. He said she was too old. Samuel felt a strange heaviness in his chest when he heard that. He looked again at the woman. She was not old. She looked perhaps a little older than the young brides people usually expected. But there was something dignified about her. She stood straight, not begging for sympathy and not crying, just waiting. Samuel watched as the crowd slowly lost interest. One by one, people returned to their business. Soon the platform became quiet again. The woman remained standing there with her suitcase beside the wooden bench. A light wind moved across the station, gently lifting the edge of her coat. Samuel could see she was trying to remain strong, but the situation must have been difficult. Traveling such a long distance only to be rejected the moment she arrived would hurt anyone. He wondered what she planned to do now. There were no hotels in Dry Creek, except for a small room above the saloon, and strangers rarely stayed long in town. For a moment, Samuel considered simply walking away. After all, the situation had nothing to do with him, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the memory of loneliness he knew too well. Maybe it was the quiet courage the woman showed by standing there without anger. Samuel slowly walked toward the bench. The wooden boards creaked under his boots. The woman noticed him approaching and looked up politely. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Samuel removed his hat out of respect. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said gently. The woman gave a small, tired smile. "Good afternoon." Her voice was calm, but carried the weight of a long journey. Samuel glanced at the suitcase beside her. Looks like you've traveled far. She nodded softly. Yes, farther than I expected. Samuel hesitated for a moment. Then he said, There's a small cafe across the street. Nothing fancy, but they serve good coffee and warm bread. Margaret looked surprised. That sounds lovely. Samuel nodded toward the road. If you like, you're welcome to join me. My treat. Margaret hesitated for a second. Traveling alone had taught her to be careful, but something about Samuel felt trustworthy. He spoke honestly and treated her with respect. Finally, she gave a gentle smile. I would like that very much, Mr. Carter. Together, they walked slowly off the train platform. The dusty road of Dry Creek stretched ahead of them. Neither of them realized it yet, but this simple walk toward a small cafe would soon lead to a decision that the small cafe in Dry Creek was quiet in the late afternoon. It was a simple place with wooden tables, a long counter, and the warm smell of fresh bread in the air. A few townspeople sat in the corner, drinking coffee and talking softly. Samuel Carter pushed the door open and stepped inside. Margaret Whitfield followed him, holding her suitcase carefully. The cafe owner, Mrs. Jenkins, looked up from behind the counter. She had lived in Dry Creek for many years and knew almost everyone in town. Well, Samuel, she said with a friendly smile, it's not often you bring company. Samuel gave a polite nod. Good afternoon, Mrs. Jenkins. Margaret smiled kindly. Good afternoon. Mrs. Jenkins looked curious, but she did not ask questions. Instead, she waved them toward a table near the window. Sit down. I'll bring coffee and bread. Samuel and Margaret sat across from each other. Sunlight came through the window and warmed the wooden table between them. For a few moments, they simply watched the quiet street outside. A wagon slowly rolled past. Two children ran down the road laughing. The town moved at its usual calm pace. Mrs. Jenkins soon returned with 2 cups of hot coffee and a basket of warm bread. Enjoy, she said before returning to the counter. Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm cup. This smells wonderful, she said. Samuel nodded. It's the best coffee in Dry Creek. They both laughed softly. For the first time since arriving in town, Margaret looked relaxed. Samuel noticed a change. You seem a little more comfortable now, he said. Margaret smiled. It feels good to sit down after such a long journey. She paused for a moment before continuing. I did not expect kindness when I arrived here today. Samuel looked slightly surprised. Why not? Margaret took a small bite of bread before answering. When someone rejects you in front of strangers, it can make you feel very small. Samuel frowned slightly. That man should have treated you better. Margaret nodded gently. Perhaps, but sometimes people only see what they expect to see. Samuel thought about that. Many people in towns like Dry Creek believe that brides should always be young and beautiful. But Samuel had learned something different during his life. Kindness and patience mattered much more. After a moment, he said, You know, my ranch is not far from town. Margaret looked interested. You live there alone? Samuel nodded slowly. I have for many years. He looked out the window for a moment before continuing. My wife passed away a long time ago. Since then, it's just been me and the horses. Margaret listened carefully. I'm sorry, she said softly. Samuel gave a small nod. Thank you. They sat quietly for a few moments. Samuel was not used to sharing personal things with people, but talking to Margaret felt natural. Finally, Margaret asked, Do you ever feel lonely out there? Samuel gave a small, honest smile. More often than I like to admit. Margaret understood that feeling. I know what that is like, she said. Samuel looked at her. You lived alone, too? Yes, Margaret replied. After my parents passed away, the house became very quiet. I kept hoping life might change someday. Samuel leaned back slightly in his chair. Outside, the sky was slowly turning orange as the sun began to set. For the first time in many years, Samuel felt something unusual in his heart. Hope. He studied Margaret for a moment. She was not flashy or dramatic, but there was warmth in her eyes and calm strength in the way she spoke. She seemed like someone who could turn a quiet house into a warm home. Samuel suddenly had a thought that surprised even him. He sat up a little straighter. Margaret, he said carefully. Yes. What kind of life were you hoping to find when you came west? Margaret thought about the question. I was hoping for a simple life, she said. A home, honest work, and someone to share it with. Samuel nodded slowly. That sounds like the kind of life I have, except for the last part. Margaret looked at him with curiosity. Samuel hesitated for a moment. He was not a man who made quick decisions. But sometimes life plays something unexpected right in front of you, and if you ignored it, you might regret it forever. Samuel took a deep breath. Margaret, he said again. She looked at him. Yes, Mr. Carter? Samuel spoke calmly but sincerely. What if you didn't have to leave Dry Creek? Margaret blinked in surprise. I'm not sure I understand. Samuel continued. My ranch has room. The house has been empty for a long time, and I could use someone who knows how to make a place feel like a home again. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. Samuel finished his thought. I know this may sound sudden, he said honestly, but would you consider building a life there with me? Margaret stared at him in shock. For a moment she could not speak. This morning she had stepped off the train, believing her future was waiting. Instead, she had been rejected. And now, only hours later, another man was offering her something she had nearly lost forever, a second chance. Samuel quickly added, You don't have to answer right away. I just thought. Margaret gently interrupted him. Mr. Carter. Samuel stopped speaking. Margaret looked at him with thoughtful eyes. Then slowly, a warm smile appeared on her face. This is the most unexpected day of my life. Samuel chuckled softly. Mine, too. Outside the cafe window, the evening light spread across Dry Creek. Neither of them knew exactly what the future would bring, but something important had begun, and by the time the sun fully set over the western hills, both Samuel and Margaret would be standing until the sun was slowly setting over the town of Dry Creek. The sky turned soft shades of orange and gold, and the warm evening light covered the dusty road outside the cafe. Inside the cafe, Samuel Carter and Margaret Whitfield still sat across from each other at the wooden table. Margaret was quiet for a moment after hearing Samuel's unexpected question. She looked down at her coffee cup and gently held it in both hands. Samuel did not rush her. He knew that what he had asked was sudden. They had only met a few hours ago. But something inside him told him that Margaret was a good and honest person. And sometimes, Samuel believed, life worked in surprising ways. Margaret finally looked up at him. Her eyes were thoughtful, but there was also warmth in them. Mr. Carter, she said softly, you are offering me something very kind. Samuel nodded. I mean every word. Margaret smiled gently. Most people would not make such an offer to someone they just met. Samuel leaned back slightly in his chair. Well, he said calmly, most days don't begin with meeting a stranger at the train station either. Margaret laughed softly at that. It felt good to laugh after such a difficult morning. She thought carefully before speaking again. When I stepped off that train today, she said, I believed my future was waiting for me. Samuel listened quietly. But when that man walked away, Margaret continued, I felt as if the door to that future had closed. She looked around the small cafe. And then you sat beside me on that bench. Samuel gave a small smile. I almost didn't. Margaret looked surprised. Really? Samuel nodded. I'm not the most talkative person, but something told me I should say hello. Margaret's smile grew warmer. I'm very glad you did. For a few moments they both sat quietly again, outside the cafe window. The street lanterns were being lit one by one. The evening had arrived. Margaret finally spoke again. You said your ranch is not far from town? That's right, Samuel answered. About 15 minutes by horse. And you live there alone? Yes. Margaret thought about that. Is a nice place? Samuel smiled. It's simple, but it has strong walls, a good roof, and a wide porch that looks out over the fields. Margaret imagined the picture in her mind. It sounded peaceful. Then Samuel said something that made her smile. And my horses are very friendly. Margaret laughed again. I like horses. Samuel leaned forward slightly. Margaret, he said gently, I know this is all very sudden, but I believe a home is not just a building. It becomes a real home when people share it. Margaret nodded slowly. I believe that, too. Samuel continued. My ranch has been quiet for many years, sometimes too quiet. Margaret could understand that feeling very well. She took a deep breath. Mr. Carter, she said, when I came west, I hoped to build a life with someone who valued kindness and honesty. Samuel listened carefully. And today, she continued, you have shown both of those things. Samuel looked slightly nervous now. He was waiting for her answer. Margaret gave a gentle smile. If you truly mean what you said, then yes. Samuel blinked in surprise. Yes. Yes. Margaret repeated softly. I would like to try building a life with you. Samuel felt a wave of relief and happiness spread through him. He had not expected the answer to come so quickly. Margaret laughed lightly when she saw the surprised look on his face. You seem shocked. Samuel chuckled. I suppose I am. Just then Mrs. Jenkins walked over from the counter. Well now, she said with a curious smile, you two have been talking for quite some time. Samuel looked at Margaret and then back at Mrs. Jenkins. Mrs. Jenkins, he said, would you happen to know if the pastor is still at the chapel this evening? Mrs. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. I believe he is. Why do you ask? Samuel glanced at Margaret. Then he said something that surprised everyone. Because Margaret and I are thinking about getting married tonight. Mrs. Jenkins' eyes widened. Well now, she said with a laugh, Dry Creek hasn't seen a surprise like that in years. Margaret smiled warmly. The decision felt sudden, but it also felt right. Sometimes people spent years searching for the right path. Other times, the right path appeared in a single unexpected day. Soon, the small town chapel was softly lit by lantern light. A few townspeople gathered quietly after hearing the surprising news. Samuel stood beside Margaret near the front of the chapel. The pastor smiled kindly as he spoke the simple wedding words. Samuel looked at Margaret with respect and gratitude. Margaret looked back at him with hope and trust. Only that morning she had arrived in Dry Creek feeling uncertain about her future. Now she was beginning a brand new life. When the ceremony ended, the small group of townspeople clapped happily. Samuel and Margaret stepped outside together. The night sky above Dry Creek was full of bright stars. Samuel looked toward the road that led to his ranch. Well, he said with a gentle smile, Mrs. Carter, shall we go home? Margaret smiled warmly. Yes, she said.